CSCMP marks its 50th anniversary in 2013. To commemorate this golden anniversary, we gathered 24 pioneers of the supply chain profession to reflect on the association's humble beginnings, the path it has traveled the past 5 decades, and to look forward to the future of the association and the supply chain discipline. Since the 1960s, the discipline has evolved from physical distribution to logistics to supply chain management, as our organization has evolved from NCPDM to CLM to CSCMP, from a humble, invisible corporate necessity to a critical component of commerce that has achieved global prominence in boardrooms and on Wall Street. Supply chain management has become a 21st century global superpower. CSCMP's founders were clearly at the forefront of forecasting the future of the physical distribution field. CSCMP has evolved too. The organization and the profession continue its evolution as it aspires even loftier goals in the brave new century, pushing the frontiers of technology and management knowledge with a new group of visionaries leading the way. Welcome to Supply Chain Pioneers, a series of conversations with the men and women who launched CSCMP and literally created one of the most dynamic and vital professions the world has ever known. The Supply Chain Pioneers video series is made possible through the support of our sponsors. DSC Logistics, ready for anything. Ernst & Young, building a better working world. Mercury Gate International Incorporated, TMS that delivers. Steel Wedge Software, single line of sight, plan, perform, profit. And the members of CSCMP.
Hi, I'm Mitch MacDonald, Group Editorial Director of CSCMP's Supply Chain Quarterly. Welcome to this episode of Supply Chain Pioneers, our ongoing series of conversations with some of the most influential individuals of the profession over the past 50 years. We're joined by a very good panel today to talk about the topic of A Discipline Comes of Age, which is a look at some of the earliest days of what is now CSCMP and the profession and how it has progressed over the years. For our discussion today, we're joined by Bob Camp, Principal with Best Practices Institute and an active member of CSCMP since 1973. Bob's business career includes stints with DuPont, Mobil Oil, and 23 years with Xerox Corporation. Next, we have Ann Drake, Chairman and CEO of DSC Logistics. Ann's been involved with CSCMP for more than 25 years and was the 2012 recipient of the CSCMP Distinguished Service Award. Next is Cliff Lynch, Principal of CS Lynch and Associates, who's been in the industry for 54 years and a member of CSCMP for 44 years. Next is Rick Schorr, who has 4 decades experience in third-party warehousing, distribution, and logistics. He's a 35-year member of CSCMP and served as the group's president in 1987. And finally, Jim Stock, the Frank Harvey Endowed Professor of Marketing at the University of South Florida. Jim's been a member of CSCMP since 1976, received the Distinguished Service Award in 2011, and has served as Program Chair of the Annual Conference and President of the Central Florida Roundtable. Welcome, everyone. Thanks for joining us today. As I mentioned, we're here to talk about a discussion with the working title, A Discipline Comes of Age. And as part of our ongoing series, we thought an appropriate place to start would be looking back at a bit of a contrast to compare to the profession as it existed years ago and how has it evolved today. So, Bob, perhaps starting with you, when you came into the career and you know it, what was the typical job of what we now call a logistics or supply chain professional?
Well, I'll give you a little history of my own personal experience. When I graduated and joined the oil and gas industry, I actually joined an organization who didn't have logistics in its title. It was called Marketing Operations, but it was essentially the movement of product from the refinery out to the customer. It was the early logistics organization. And they had nobody in there with any title that had logistics in their title. I happened to join as a transportation engineer. I got a little bit leery about staying with oil and gas for my entire career, so I jumped into the chemical industry. And in that case, I joined an organization called Traffic and Distribution. So the title had increased a little bit in its scope, and I was a distribution engineer. And then after that, I moved to the high-tech industry, and the organization was known as the Distribution and Logistics Organization. And I think I had a title of something more functional, like inventory control manager, manager of transportation and the like. So if you just judge the change in the profession from the titles of the organizations we were with early on and the personal titles that we had, there's been quite a bit of growth from traffic to supply chain management today.
With back then the function clearly existing, obviously existing, but
Still,
not even formally referred to that way.
Correct, yes.
And your thoughts on the topic?
I was on the sidelines as a daughter and as a wife in the 60s and the 70s, so I sort of stood from afar. But one of my memories is when someone brought technology to one of our conferences. And I remember he was this guy with this long, long hair, and we all thought, oh boy, what does this mean? We liked our clipboards. So when I think back on those early years, it seems like it really was a long time ago. I would fast forward then to the 80s, which is when I actually got involved. And I think of it as physical distribution and traffic management and warehousing, right, similar to what your experience has been. And I do remember when we changed our name to CLM, and I thought it was fantastic because I thought here we're staying on the edge of what it really is. It really is more about logistics and movement and keeping track and those kinds of things. But each decade, when I look back on it, I feel it keeps transforming, as do the names that we use.
Right.
Keep transforming, as do the activities that we perform, keep transforming.
Cliff?
Well, when I started in the industry, the primary entry level was through the traffic department. And there was no logistics industry as we know it today. There was a warehousing industry, which consisted then primarily of smaller family-owned businesses, and there was very little opportunity to enter, through that route. So most of us who wanted to be traffic managers, we'd start off as traffic clerks, and our aspirations, of course, would be a traffic manager at a plant or a distribution center. And then if you did a really good job there, you could move to the corporate office, wherever that might be. So it wasn't until the early 60s, about the time that CSCMP was formed, that we even started to hear about the word distribution and
right,
the expansion into other areas. The transportation industry was regulated at that time, so there was plenty of work to be done in that area without branching off into others. But that settled down in the late 70s. There were two reasons. There was one, in 1978, what was then NCPDM commissioned a productivity study that I believe A.T. Kearney conducted, and that was the first time anybody had ever looked at productivity in this industry. And then with 1980 and deregulation of the transportation industry, then everything was up for grabs.
Right.
So that's when we really started looking at these other disciplines and areas.
Rick?
I guess my comment would be, having grown up in a third-party industry, as Cliff mentioned, early on it was just small family-owned businesses, provided services maybe in one city, and usually only a single service, maybe transportation, maybe warehousing. Then as we got into the 70s, that transitioned very quickly, even before deregulation, where you started providing what I would call a distribution service, being warehousing, transportation, and maybe some customer service kinds of things. And of course, then as Ann mentioned, going into the field of logistics, where you're in multi-cities providing multi kinds of disciplines for major corporations, those were the changes that I remember the most.
And Chip?
Well, it's interesting, as you see, and some of the folks on this panel have been involved in NCPDM longer than I have, but starting in the mid-70s, one of the things I noticed were really two things. One was most everyone who was involved in this profession got in there from some other area or by accident. It was not designed in terms of their education and experience. They just got put there and discovered it. That's been a significant change over the years with this organization and others. Now people are graduating with specific degrees in logistics and supply chain. The second area is the notion of the glass ceiling. early on, the ceiling was probably maybe at the vice president level. I remember Cliff at Quaker Oats was one of the few vice presidents of distribution at that time. And that was about as far as you could go. And now we're seeing examples of people at Walmart and Apple and other companies who are senior executive CEOs, COOs of corporations that came up through distribution and logistics. And so it's been quite a change over the years, and NCPDM, CLM, and now CSCMP has been part of that process.
No, it's been an interesting migration. When I entered or started covering this field as a journalist, I was the news editor first at a magazine called Traffic Management. And it wasn't until 1995 when I became chief editor that we changed the name to Logistics Management. And I can specifically recall getting letters from readers who were unhappy because, in their view, logistics was a buzzword. It had no legs. It would be going away soon. Why are you changing the name of a 50-year-old magazine? Although I know none of us were there at the time, but certainly based on some of the evolutionary steps we've just discussed, there was something in the early to mid-'60s that was a triggering event. There were a group of individuals who came together and said, this is a profession that is coming together and is worthy of a professional association. Anyone, maybe starting with you, Cliff, thoughts on what did that mean, the formation of a formal association for the profession, whether we called it distribution, traffic, logistics, certainly not supply chain at that time. But what was the catalyst, and what has that meant to the profession that this organization came online in '63?
Well, at that time we were, as an industry, sort of struggling with having an identity crisis, for want of a better term. And the big concern back then, or one of the big concerns, was being accepted by your senior management. Mm-hmm. And everybody was groping for a way to be recognized and therefore hopefully be on a fast track up through the organization. And it was a struggle. I mean, the individual companies tried and weren't having much success. And NCPDM really gave us a catalyst for pushing ahead, because you met people in the same situation you were in, basically, and you learned from these people. They had really good ideas in many cases that you could take back and use in your own organization. It was small enough that you knew everybody and you wouldn't hesitate to call somebody on the phone and say, I have this situation, you know, what do I do now? And I think just this organization, I think, really made this industry. I don't think there's any question about it.
Yeah, I would agree. Rick, thoughts on that and what it has meant to the profession?
Well, I was going to add to that. The educational mission of the NCPDM then was so outstanding that you had to become involved. And as Cliff mentioned, it gave you an opportunity to trade ideas with other people in an emerging kind of business, if you would. But they always, and I give Don Bowersox a lot of credit for this, they always kept their eye on the educational mission as far as the national convention went and as far as the offerings that they had.
Yep. We've touched on education.
Touching on what Rick just mentioned, when the founders came together, and there was a video of the founders, I think about 1995, at the annual conference that Don Bowersox moderated. And when they spoke of the foundation of that organization, there was not an existing organization for those in distribution, which is what it was called, physical distribution, or just distribution at that time. And interestingly, with Don and a few other academics involved, the organization took on a different aura than most organizations, which were really trade shows and organizations where you went to have fun and network. You didn't learn. And that was a unique part of NCPDM. There was a place you could go, certainly to network, but you would learn. And there was a mixture of academics, consultants, practitioners of all kinds, government people, military, where they could go and they could learn the newest trends or developments in a certain area, learn specific aspects of this area of physical distribution, then logistics, and finally supply chain management. And it was one place to go for a concentrated period of time that was well worth the value added of the money you spent, the time away from your business to get that education.
And I think an important point, I'll turn to you, Bob, is the notion of an association of individuals and a profession. not an association built to have a trade show or to go in a lot of those other, and subtle though it may be, a professional association, not an industry association, which I've always thought has been an important distinction through all the years.
Well, I'd like to give credit to the association for taking a number of very important initiatives to lead in this regard. And in particular, I take my hat off to Don Bowersox for recognizing that there needed to be an assessment of what the needs of those that were in the profession really were, so that then the organization could build on that. And I was fortunate enough to be tapped to be the project manager for the first educational needs assessment that was done within NCPDM in those days. And it was conducted by SRI, Stanford Research Institute. And it was really the first time that we set a baseline for what the membership felt they were lacking in light of where professionally they wanted to go. And it was very pervasive then in going out into all of the workshops that we then set up in the annual conferences, and setting up the roundtables, and giving direction to them, saying that the organization is now spoken, here's what they need, how can we deliver it? And I think we really have to take our hats off to people that had the insight to undertake that kind of initiative. There have been a number of others that have built on that over time.
Right.
So there's been that kind of support for people in their professions.
Ann, any thoughts on this?
I would just add that because of the emphasis on such a broad array of types of folks who did types of pieces of the industry is probably the reason that we really have survived so successfully, because we were broad enough that there was still more to learn and more to be learned from all parts of the supply chain and from all kinds of people doing all kinds of work. So I think the learning component, as we've discussed, is critical both in the past and in the future, and this breadth of the types of professionals that are involved.
Professor Bowersox and his associates certainly planted an important seed with the educational component when the association was started, and that seed certainly found purchase in soil and has sprouted and continued to sprout even today. The comparison, I think, Cliff, in some conversations we've had in the past, we've talked about, late 50s and early 60s was a very short list of maybe 2 well-known national universities who had a program that even touched the functions served by this profession. Let's talk for a little bit, and Jim, I'll turn to you to start if we could, about the evolution of education both with the association and the educational opportunities at the university level that have expanded over the years since CSCMP was formed.
Well, let me mention a number of things. One, to tie in with the comment that was made about legitimizing the profession. One of the things that NCPDM began was the Research Strategies Committee that was formed to work with industry to create projects of various kinds. And early in the organization, we did lots of very large projects, the productivity study that Cliff mentioned earlier. But I particularly remember the one in 1976 by Lalonde and Zinsser on customer service, meaning and measurement. The first study ever done on customer service metrics, which said here's something distribution does and you can measure value from it. And then we did a number of very large studies after that time, and then a number of events occurred after 9/11, which forced all organizations to restructure and rethink. And we started thinking about where we could create more value added with smaller things. So I remember when I was chair of the Research Strategies Committee, we started the CLM Explorers, and the Innovation Award with Supply Chain Brain was started during that time, and the international one that we have, the Global Explorers on countries and so forth, which were very small, but yet they each added value to individuals. And that's one of the things we've seen over time in terms of the educational focus of NCPDM, CLM, and now CSCMP. It's always been, how do we make the profession better? And early in the organization, we had probably a very good mix of companies, but they were all senior executives primarily. We didn't have many young folks that were coming into the discipline. We've seen that change over time. We've certainly seen it change over time in terms of the women membership of the organization. Much like in the early days of most organizations, it was heavily dominated by men.
Sure.
Now when you look at the studies which are done that shows that one of the top 10 areas of employment for women is supply chain management logistics. A study just came out of Georgia in terms of their bureau in Atlanta, which said in the next 15 years, only 20-some% of the positions in logistics supply chain management will be filled by college graduates. And so where are all those people going to come from? That's going to be increased educational, certification, other kinds of things. And from education, back to Bowersox, as you may be aware, he was the co-author of the first, if you will, distribution book, Bowersox, Mikey, and Lalonde, way back when, 40 years ago now or so. And there weren't many offerings. And it was interesting when you talked to Don about that book, trying to get a book published for a field that didn't exist. And it took many attempts, and finally Ronald Press, I think it was, published that book years ago. And it just started, if you will, a snowball rolling down the hill where there's a lot more textbooks now, both in logistics, supply chain management, which allows us to teach courses at various levels. The DVD that CSCMP put out, we use extensively in college courses to show students what supply chain management is all about. And what that has done is get people interested at an earlier age. So as I mentioned earlier, you have people going into the profession as something which they're shooting towards as opposed to something they get into by accident.
Right, which had been the path.
Yes.
Folks, do you think the growth in educational opportunities outside of the association at the university and college level, has that been, if you will, a market response to a heightened awareness within the economy of the importance of the functions of logistics and supply chain? Rick?
To answer that question directly, the answer would be yes. You mentioned earlier there were maybe only 2 universities that were noted at all for having logistics programs. Of course, the first one that comes to mind is Don's at Michigan State. And I'm thinking of the things outside of the Council of Logistics Management that happened because of that. I remember Don coming to us in the American Warehousemen's Association and saying, you know, you've got all these young people coming into your discipline who need some kind of training. And so several of us sat down, Roger Carlson being one of the prime ones, and put together a week-long program in conjunction with Michigan State, which Don was always the keynote speaker. And that, as far as I know, has continued to this day, with opportunity to take young people and teach them something about the discipline, particularly pertinent to their own jobs in warehousing.
Yep. How about the mere fact that we have young people coming out of high school into college that are self-selecting this as a major course of study? That in and of itself, maybe as few as 20, 25 years ago, Cliff, that was, you don't think, a common occurrence then as it is today, do you?
Well, I think a lot of that's a result of the expansion of the field.
Yep.
It covers so many things. If you take supply chain literally, there's not much left except the senior management of the company.
Right.
So there are a lot more opportunities, I think, and the universities, I think, have at least those who work toward these kinds of degrees. I think they've tried to keep up with the changes. I know my old alma mater of Tennessee was just a transportation,
Sure.
Major, and then they've evolved, of course, into a much broader logistics and supply chain kind of a function. I think, though, if I could, one
Please.
thing that went on back then that we don't see so much of today is a result of a lot of things I know, but we shared a lot more information with each other back in the early days. I mean, that's how we really learned. We learned from each other.
Yep.
And there's a reluctance today to be quite as forthcoming, I guess, in sharing information, and probably for good reasons in many cases. But we work together a lot.
Do you think it's because, as all this has gone on in the past 50 years, and we'll be having later episodes talking about some of the other issues that have driven the enhanced view at the corporate level of logistics and supply chain, but do you think folks are less apt to share some of their internal best practices because logistics has clearly become a key competitive differentiator in the marketplace? Is that the basis of the hesitancy, you think?
I think that's a big part of it, because I think a lot of companies learned early on, particularly companies that are in the same business. I mean, whether you want this cereal or that cereal is kind of academic in many cases, but what they're really selling is their service and their logistics and their supply chain.
Right. Yeah.
I'd like to look at it through a little bit different lens. I think one of the reasons that the profession has come to where it is today is because it is data-based. There is data there. We are a profession that is countable, unless like perhaps marketing and the like. You know, we deal in things, and so over time we've been very, very fortunate to build up not only a database of data, performance data for the profession that is really quite wide and deep, but we've also been able to develop a set of models that actually say what is supply chain, and where does it begin, and where does it end, and what are the key components. And then for each of those key components, you know, what are the significant measures that you have along the way. And we can now share data across different industries, because it's a fact that one industry may be doing something which another industry is not, and you can learn from them. And the first thing you want to know is, well, you know, what's their performance compared to us to start with, and then drill down deeper to find out, you know, what are the basic best practices that you need to pursue. So we've been very, very fortunate to be able to have now quite highly developed databases of performance measures, and these models like the Schorr model that tell us, you know, what the key components. We have agreement on what the performance measures and what the key elements of our profession are, and that's lacking in a lot of other professions.
No, I would agree. And turning to you on this one, the importance of research and the types of research. You know, Jim had mentioned one of the first studies, I think, in the mid-'70s on customer service, those productivity studies or whatever. It's tough to imagine what the profession would be like today without a lot of these data points, metrics, best practices, or whatever. In your view, how important a part has that been of CSCMP over the years?
I think that the whole emphasis on research and learning is what really differentiates this group from many others. And the research is usable, it's readable. You don't have to be a researcher to pick up the journal and read it yourself. And it was a place to learn not only from each other, but to learn some of the softer skills, but it was a place to actually learn from the research. So I think that helped people who were members to really catapult their careers and help them to become more of the expert that was available when you couldn't really study it in many places.
Right, right. I'm sorry, Rick, were you going to?
I was just going to add, I think Cliff hit upon maybe the most important thing of all, was the sharing of research, data, best practices with each other back when nobody else seemed to really care.
Right.
That's what made it so important. The fact that you could have a problem, call somebody, be it a customer or somebody who's a competitor, and say, here's my problem, how did you guys handle this? And everybody was willing, because we were all learning, was able to share that information. I think it's incredibly important.
And that issue, and this might give us a good topic to work through or close, the issue of sharing not just best practices, but sharing information about your operations as so many companies' supply chains have become so extended, whether it's even domestically with other partners external to the company, or even by further extension, you know, the globalization of our economies and many companies or whatever. What can an association like CSCMP do to help foster better communications and sharing of ideas than exists today? Would you like to start, Jim?
Well, I think obviously past history is an indicator of what will work. When you're forecasting, you oftentimes use historical data to forecast the future. But at the same time, you use combinations of forecasts to get the most accurate one. And I think that's what CSCMP is doing in terms of we're using the old techniques that have worked. You know, the cooperation of practitioners and academics and consultants and others working together on small and large research projects. One of the things you know is there's a potpourri of people on the annual conference, that represent all the disciplines and professions and industries. And so you get that kind of interaction that you wouldn't get if you just went to an industry association group
Sure.
or something of that. One of the things I think CSCMP has done in recent years, a lot of this has come as organizations have had to be more proactive since 9/11, when a lot of industry association numbers went drastically down, companies cut back for a variety of reasons. They've had to become more value-added centric. And one of the things has been a lot more communication over the past several years of the organization to its membership, and a lot more things that you can pick and choose the information you want to receive. And it's easy if you're a member, of course, to interact with other members. And that's been an ongoing thing since the first days when I started in 1976. So I think communication opportunities are there. We'll use, obviously, technology and other things to foster that, as they do in the real world. But I think communication is always going to be the watchword of this organization into the future.
Rick, we'll go right down the line. Thoughts on the...
I would come at it from a different angle, maybe, one that was very important to me, which is outsourcing. Outsourcing used to be a dirty word. It is no longer. I think this organization has done a lot to foster the growth in outsourcing, the realization that people who only provide a specific piece of the supply chain could be a very important addition to that. I know the years I spent consulting, that was really what we went after. Most corporations still had the feeling that we can probably do this better than anybody, and then found out the hard way that that was not true.
Right.
So I think that's a very important thing to continue to push.
Yeah, and that was, and we'll go to you to continue this, Cliff, but that was a very important point as early as, well, let's say 20 years ago. There was this lingering view that outsourcing to a 3PL, the third-party logistics service provider, if that was your job within the company, you were very sensitive about that move, because what, you're going to outsource my job somewhere else? And we know that did not happen. It simply turned it over to a group that had a stronger core competency. Would you agree, Cliff?
Oh, I agree.
I think
agree
you would,
totally. Yeah, and I think too, the thing that we need more of that maybe we're not emphasizing quite enough is the collaboration and cooperation and ability to negotiate within your own company. We talk a lot about collaboration with our vendors and suppliers and customers and all that, but at least my experience has been the biggest obstacles that you hit in trying to put some of these joint projects together are within your own company.
Yeah.
Everybody has their agenda, their department has their agenda and responsibilities. Even many senior managers manage by function. As we talk supply chain, we manage by function. And I think until we learn to do a better job of that, it's going to be a little bit of a struggle.
Yeah. The silos theoretically have gone away, but folks are still working in that same footprint, even if the wall's not there anymore.
Exactly.
I think that this organization has a chance to be a real leader in what I think is going to be a whole new level of collaboration globally, everywhere, up and down the supply chain. And because we come together and because we have such a broad group of thinkers and doers, I think it could be a really good place to take us to a really global plan, a global view to make the whole world a better place to live in.
And certainly, things are only going to get more complex. Things are only going to move faster. We are only going to get further into globalization. Would you agree about the need to communicate and keep folks plugged into what's going on is only going to continue to be more important?
Not only that, but I would suggest that by virtue that we're all members of this profession, that is a door opener when we want to go and talk to others. Because we can say, look, we're both members of the association, you're in another industry, but I'd like to learn a little bit about something maybe I heard you say at an annual conference. And by virtue of the fact you can say, you know, I'm in the distribution business, you're in the distribution business, so are you willing to share? That's a very positive resource that you have, to be able to go and say you're both members, and so therefore can we share? And it was very pervasive for us in one case where we wanted to compare for a very important piece of our warehousing operation, the picking operation, where we wanted to take a look at a small catalog company based in Freeport, Maine, because we learned that their picking operation was like 3 times faster than ours. So here was a
Who would put
here's a
who would put an
gotcha.
operation in Freeport, Maine?
Oh,
Yeah, they'll be-
the only outfit that this year, by the way, is their 100th anniversary. I don't know if many people know that, but this is their 100th anniversary of existence. Well, you know, we wanted to learn more about this. I didn't hesitate to call the distribution manager. His name was Tom Day. I called him up and I said, hey, you're a member, I'm a member. What are the chances for us getting together? And it was just the best circumstance you could possibly ask for. So by virtue of just being in the same organization, you know, you have a resource available to you.
And tying in with what Ann was saying, one of the great things about this organization from its start, it's always been, we talk about the product life cycle and marketing. This organization has always been in the introductory phase of the product life cycle in terms of physical distribution. There was no organization. Logistics, which interestingly the academic journal of this organization, Journal of Business Logistics, began in 1978, 7 years before this organization changed its name to Council of Logistics Management. And now with supply chain management, you know, that is only 30 years old in terms of a discipline, if you will. And this organization is one of the early ones, although there are others out there as well, that this is in the introductory phase of the product life cycle of supply chain. We've only touched the hem of the garment for what is potentially possible in terms of collaboration, integration, coordination, communication, all these other things. And that's what makes it such a great profession for young people. There's so much that lies ahead that has been, you know, the foundation's been laid, but now we have to put on the walls and the roof and do all the inside detail work. That's the next generation.
I think that brings us to a beautiful close. I'd like to thank all of you very much for joining us. I think it's been a great discussion. And that concludes this episode of Supply Chain Pioneers. We look forward to seeing you in the next episode. Until then, I'm Mitch MacDonald.